All right, it's Tuesday morning, about mid-morning, and I had melted some scrap binding yesterday with acetone and made a patch to fill about a 1/32 of an inch or so gap between the bindings. And I let it sit overnight to harden. And today I'm going to very carefully do the leveling process. So here I have a razor blade with only one section of the blade exposed, um, about the width of the binding, because you don't want to use the razor blade on anything other than the binding that you're trying to level. And so there's just some scotch tape protecting the rest of the blade. And here I'm very carefully, very softly starting by leveling the top of the binding patch. And it takes a long time. You don't want to dig too forcefully, because then you run the risk of just totally pulling out the plastic binding patch. And so you just kind of very softly run the razor blade over the plastic. And then check it every so often. It takes a long time. It doesn't become level right away, as you see there. And so now I've switched to a chisel, flat chisel, to try to get a little bit more of it off carefully, kind of slicing it very thinly. Again, being careful not to catch on the plastic patch, because again, you don't want to pull it out, because then you'll have to just refill it and wait another day. But it's kind of just shaving off a little bit more. It just makes it somewhat easier than just scraping it with the razor blade. And I'm holding the chisel bevel side down, because if I hold it the other way, you run the risk of digging into the binding instead of kind of scraping or shaving, scooping upwards. So I just want to get enough of the binding down so I can finish it off more smoothly with, again, with the razor blade, but then later with the sandpaper. So having it a bit lower makes it somewhat easier to do this job. Going slowly, more slowly than you feel like, is the key, because you feel like just doing it all in one fell swoop, right? But you can't, because you'll damage it and undo all you've done. So it's starting to get a little bit lower, but you see the edges, the right and left edges of the fill are still raised a bit. Now I've got 600 grit sandpaper, and so that helps do it more smoothly too, but it's such a light grit that it really doesn't do a lot, but it slowly helps to smooth it down. But it's still, you can see it's still kind of sticking up from it's not flush. But slower is better. Eventually, after I'm all done doing the sandpaper, later I'll use micro mesh, wet sand it. Or maybe with some oil, I'm not sure. The different grits of micro mesh And eventually the micro mesh hopefully will take away any dullness as well as leveling it down. And I'm going to take off the tape to kind of see what I've got. See, it's still above the surface there, but it's not all patchy and galoppy as it was when I began. Oh, this is the side of the binding. Yeah, the side of the binding instead of the top. Starting to work on that wider side. And again, you got to be very careful when you're scraping from the edges in. Again, you have to be careful because it's easy to catch the edges of the fill, and you don't want to do that. Sometimes going at a diagonal angle helps too. And again, I want to be careful not to, that's why I have the tape there. I want to be careful not to touch the razor to any of the finished areas of the guitar. Always checking with my finger to feel how flesh it's becoming. Okay, that's somewhat better. Doing it without the tape there kind of sometimes helps because the tape raises, doesn't allow you to really see or feel the smoothing flush to the other surfaces. But you have to even be more careful because without the tape there, if I slip and hit the razor blade on the finished side or top, then you just have more things you have to fix later. But having the tape on both sides of the small area of the razor blade helps you to avoid nicking any other section of the guitar. So it's getting a little bit better. Again, always feeling. The angle at which you hold the razor blade helps too. You just kind of get a feel for what angle would be best for smoothing. So if you look down there, you can't really see it, right? But it's there right where I'm pointing there. So I'm going to use the sandpaper again. Again, being very careful with the sandpaper to touch the rest of the guitar as little as I can. That just helps finishing. After this is all flush and everything and wet sanded with micro mesh, I'll probably French polish it with shellac to try to get the color to match better. Because this old binding has yellowed over the years, and so when you do a patch like this, it's not yellowed, right? But it's not too bad. It's not too much lighter. But to try to make it more all uniform color will make the patch less noticeable. And then I do the edges because the edges are kind of cut or rounded, beveled a little bit. So here it is at the moment. Not too bad. And I still have micro meshing to do. You can see you can kind of see that line, but maybe the shellacking later will disguise that, and maybe the micro mesh will. So not bad. Here's what it looked like yesterday. I used acetone to melt some binding scraps, patched it, and removed the tape. And here's what it looked like when I started today.